Welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's History at High Noon program entitled The Struggle for Women's Suffrage in North Carolina, with special guest speaker and MOH curator RaeLana Poteat. History at High Noon is just one of MOH's exciting digital offerings available through our History at Home initiative. So if you'd like to learn more, head over to the museum's website at www.ncmuseumofhistory.org. Before we get started, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our North Carolina Museum of History Associates and Foundation for making today's program possible. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support, which in addition to many other things, helps make events like today's event happen. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an associates member, head over to their website at www.ncmoha.com. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who graciously donated funds towards today's program. We endeavor to keep our programming free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping our series going, and we just wanted to say thank you so much for your support of the museum and our programs. We appreciate you. A few housekeeping tips for today. We ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of today's program, and that if you have any questions for our speaker, to please type them into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the lecture, I will ask the speaker as many of your questions as time allows. All right, so now it's my honor to introduce today's speaker, RaeLana Poteat, Curator of Political and Social History for the North Carolina Museum of History. RaeLana is a native North Carolinian who has worked at the Museum of History for just over 2 decades. She attended the College of William and Mary for her undergraduate and got her master's degree from Wake Forest. She has served as the Curator of Political and Social History and recently became the museum's Chief Curator. She has curated exhibits on subjects ranging from North Carolina's governors and Watergate to historic clothing and historic photographs. She also worked on the museum's large chronological history of the state entitled The Story of North Carolina. Her most recent exhibit is You Have to Start a Thing, and she's excited to talk to us about the struggle for women's suffrage in North Carolina during today's program. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Ray. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I am going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint with everyone so that you are not looking at my face through this whole presentation. At least I'm going to try. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and minimize myself so I'm not blocking anything. I'm very happy to talk to y'all today about You Have to Start a Thing, our new exhibit. This exhibit was open for just a few days before we shut down for the pandemic, so I'm going to assume that most of you have not seen it. And this talk will be a mix of the history of the women's suffrage movement in North Carolina and sort of just a tour of the exhibit as well. You may be wondering about the title, You Have to Start a Thing. This comes from a quote by Lillian Exum Clement, who was the first female state legislator in North Carolina. She was actually elected, interestingly, in her primary before women got the right to vote in the spring of 1920, and then began serving after women had the right to vote. She was interviewed by the News and Observer in 1921 about being the first woman in the General Assembly, and she said, "I want to blaze a trail for other women. I know that years from now there will be many other women in politics, but you have to start a thing." And the team working on this exhibit thought that was a very powerful quote and really liked what it said about the struggle for women in getting the vote in politics in North Carolina, and so we chose that for our title. I wanted to show you just a few pictures of the exhibit. I took some of the pictures that you'll see today right before we opened, so they're not totally complete, but it should give you a pretty good idea of what the exhibit looks like. It is organized into 3 sections. We have one part that's about the national movement for women's suffrage. That sort of sets the story with those familiar names that you know about. A section that is about the struggle in North Carolina, which is actually quite different from the national story. And then a final section that talks about what happened after 1920. So, you know, women get the right to vote in 1920, but we know, of course, in North Carolina that Jim Crow segregation means that women of color don't really get that vote until 1965. We also talk about the Equal Rights Amendment here and it not passing. We talk about women in politics in the state. So that's sort of our, part that brings us up to the present day. Before I get too much further in, I want to cover a few ideas. I don't expect y'all to be able to read these labels, but I wanted to show you these are our sort of call out labels in the exhibit, and they highlight important points that we want to make sure that visitors get. And so some of those for the get-go here are just some terms that we use. Suffrage, obviously, the right to vote, but woman suffrage versus women's suffrage. Today, you tend to hear women's suffrage a lot, but at the time, they used the term woman suffrage, and so you'll hear me using that a lot today. And then also just suffragist or suffragette. North Carolina was very conservative, the women here, in their approach to trying to gain suffrage. They were trying to appeal to the men in power. And suffragette was a term that was coined, a pejorative term for very militant women working for suffrage in England. And so it was not a term that North Carolina women wanted associated with their struggle here. So they would have preferred being called suffragists. What's up with all this yellow is another one we have. There's a lot of yellow and purple in the exhibit, and most of you will know that those are colors associated with the fight for suffrage. Yellow is the color that would have been used most in North Carolina because most women fighting for suffrage here would have been associated with the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and their colors were yellow or yellow and white. You can see that on the artifact sash that we're showing here. The National Woman's Party had the colors purple, yellow, or gold, and white. And while most North Carolina women weren't associated with them, you tend to see those colors used a lot today to signify the suffrage movement. And then if you ever see anything that is purple, white, and green, that's probably associated with the movement in England. And then one final one, why are some of the pictures in this exhibit so grainy? We wanted to point this out to people because some of the images we have in here are not up to our usual exhibit standards. And I put two examples in here of Lila Barnwell and Kate Hosfeld, who were suffragists in the state. Many of the women that we feature here were not necessarily remembered historically. You know, there are very few North Carolina suffragists that we remember the names of today. And so these women, sometimes the only photos we can find of them are run in old newspapers or yearbooks. And we wanted to just point that out to visitors, that until very recently, a lot of archives and museums did not feel it necessary to save images of women. And so it is harder to find good images for women the further back you go. At the beginning of the exhibit, we have a little interactive that asks people, could you have voted at different times in North Carolina? We know that especially younger people might not understand that concept, that voting rights changed over time. And so here you can see if you were a white male or a male of color or a white female or a woman of color, whether you would have been able to vote at different times throughout history, and that sort of preps you as you go into the exhibit. So our earliest portion is the national movement, and this is where you see some of those familiar names. You know, initially the struggle for women's suffrage is going to start around mid-1800s. Most people are familiar with the Seneca Falls Convention, which is in 1848, where women are gathering for the first time and openly, you know, asking for the right to vote. The women who are involved in the struggle early on are going to be almost exclusively white, well-educated, and living in the northern states. Very, very few women in the South were talking about suffrage at this time. Some of those names that we're very familiar with, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they met in 1851 and worked together for decades in the fight for suffrage. Lucy Stone, who was one of the first women to keep her maiden name when she married. There were African-American women in this early period who were also fighting for suffrage. Sojourner Truth is a great example there, who was born enslaved, but then became a part of both the abolitionist and the suffrage movements. And a lot of these women were involved in both of those movements. So that's the early period. By the Civil War, or after the Civil War, you do get a split in that the group of people who are fighting for women's suffrage, and it is based a lot on racism. There are some women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who believe that white educated women should get the vote before, or at least at the same time as formerly enslaved African-American men. And so they don't want to support the 15th Amendment, giving the right to vote to them if women don't get it as well. And so they break off and form their own organization. And so for a few decades, you have two different organizations that are fighting for the right to vote. They're leading one and Lucy Stone is leading another. It's important, though, to know that there are African-American women who are fighting for suffrage during this period and throughout up until the 1920s. Some examples that we talk about in the exhibit: Ida B. Wells Barnett, who founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Illinois. Nancy Helen Burroughs, who actually was the leader of a women's Baptist group that was the largest African-American women's group in the country. Mary Church Terrell, who took part in marches, parades, picketing the White House. So there are very familiar names to us, and some names that aren't as familiar, who were African-American women fighting for the right to vote. However, most of these women are not living in the South. It's a lot harder to find those active suffragists in the South. By the early 1890s, that split that I just mentioned has healed, and the groups have come back together, and you have the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Those groups, or that group, is holding national conventions. They're have a newspaper that they've put out, but they've been fighting. The struggle has been going on now since the late 1840s, and not that much has really been accomplished. You have some Western states where women have the right to vote, but the East Coast, there's not much going on there. Things haven't changed in quite a while. You do have that element of racism that is still a part of it. You have African-American members of the group, but they're maybe not always welcome at the conventions that are held in the South. And things have just been going along the same way for a while. And you get a few new younger leaders come into the movement who by 1913 have come up with this idea of sort of relaunching the movement. They really want to change from trying to fight state by state to fighting for a national amendment, because they believe that that is going to be the way forward. You have two women in particular who are going to plan this large parade, sort of pageant in the nation's capital, in which they are very consciously going to try and cast a new image for women fighting for suffrage. They very much focus. You can see on the upper right here, Inez Milholland, who was a lawyer and one of the very active suffragists, is riding, in her flowing robes on a white stallion at the beginning of the parade. You have women marching in the groups, their professional organizations. On the bottom left, that's a group of nurses marching. You have, women marching with their alma maters, and it's very much sort of a youthful movement of women. They particularly, placed beautiful women like Inez at the front of the parade to try and counter the image that had evolved over time as maybe a little bit of a, argumentative spinster women who were asking for suffrage, and they're sort of casting it as a new century, a new movement with this parade. And you have Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who are those two women that are really working for this, and they had worked in England and gotten some of their ideas from the suffrage movement there. Another story that comes out of this parade that's important, down in the bottom right-hand corner, is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who came with her group from Illinois to march in the parade, sort of towards the last minute of organizing this. Alice Paul got nervous because DC was a very segregated city at the time. She was nervous that they would lose support in the southern states if African-American suffragists marched side by side with white suffragists. And so she asked the African-Americans who were there, they sort of discouraged them from the get-go, and then the ones who did come, they asked them to march at the back of the parade. And there, Delta Sigma Theta did march there with Mary Church Terrell. There were African-Americans that marched in this parade. Ida B. Wells, though, chose to sort of stand off to the side and wait till the Illinois delegation came by, and then she stepped out and joined her delegation as she had intended to all along. As I mentioned, they, or maybe I didn't mention it, they planned this parade for March 3rd, 1913, which was the day before Wilson's inauguration. So they knew there would be lots of people, there would be crowds in town, and they wanted to take advantage of that. However, these crowds did come out to see the parade, but they got rowdy fairly quickly. There were around 5,000 women marching in the parade. The police did nothing to control the crowds, and fairly quickly this got a little bit chaotic. Men in particular were shoving some of the suffragists, spitting on them, cursing at them. Dozens of women were injured and had to go to the hospital. And it became very much a big national story. It got covered in all the national newspapers, and it actually did bring a lot of positive coverage for the suffrage movement. It relaunched their media coverage. They got a lot of sympathy for the way that they were treated. So it did do what the women were hoping that it would do. We're getting ready, though, after that parade, to have yet another split in the movement. You had, as I mentioned down here on the bottom right, you can see Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who are tired of the very conservative approach that I'm going to call it NAWSA from here on out, just to be shorter, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Their leaders, Carrie Chapman Catt and the Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, had a much more conservative approach. They tended to use their connections to powerful people to try and push a state-by-state suffrage approach. And then once enough states had voted for suffrage, they would be able to pass the national amendment. Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and the younger women that they led were tired of waiting for their rights to be handed to them, and they wanted to take a much more active approach. These two women had been trained in England with more militant approaches, and they were ready to break away. So a few months after that parade, they formed the Congressional Union, which is later known as the National Woman's Party, and they followed far different tactics. They were known as more militant tactics, but they are the kinds of tactics that we are familiar with today. The upper left-hand picture here is women picketing the White House. Members of the National Women's Party were the first people to do this. The concept, when you see people standing outside the White House holding signs or protesting today, you know, these women started that concept. Their headquarters was just right across the park, and starting in January of 1917, every morning they would walk out with their banners. You know, you can see the one there that's Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? The colors and the other banners that they're holding are that purple, gold, and white that were their party colors. And they would stand there, they were called the silent sentinels, and take all the abuse that people gave at them as they walked by. President Wilson would see them as he came in and out of the White House. They stood there in all kinds of weather, and they came up with that concept of picketing. Much of the nation found it disrespectful. They didn't like the militancy, particularly in North Carolina. They did not want to be associated with like those sort of tactics. And the National Women's Party lost a lot of favor when they continued these tactics once World War I started. The central picture here is one of my favorites because that is Virginia Arnold, who is actually a North Carolinian, one of the few involved in the National Women's Party and up on the national level, holding her Kaiser Wilson banner. So they continued to push Wilson about his support for democracy while women couldn't vote in America. And they lost some favor for that. They began to arrest these women as they were picketing, initially on charges like blocking the sidewalk. They were sent to jail. You can see on the right, Lucy Burns, who is in jail at the time. The women were very upset that they were being treated as regular prisoners and not political prisoners. So they began hunger strikes, and then they were force-fed while in prison. And as news of that leaked out to the press, once again, sort of sympathy turned back towards them because of the horrific treatment that they were receiving while they were imprisoned. And then the bottom left corner is yet another tactic that they had, which were called watchfires, and they would burn the speeches, excuse me, copies of speeches from President Wilson where he was calling for democracy abroad, but not recognizing the fact that women in America couldn't vote. And once again, even these suffragists are not recognizing really the fact that they're really only asking for the right to vote for educated white women. So there's lots of hypocrisy and layers to this story. But those were the tactics that were going on. One of the groups nationally, NAWSA, as I said, still more conservative, and that's the group that's going to have more attention in North Carolina. So as we move into that story in North Carolina, the fight for suffrage here, it's going to look different from that national story because of the conservatism of the South. This is one of the best known pictures we have of suffragists in our state. It's the only picture we have where suffragists are wearing banners that say votes for women. And I find this picture fascinating because we know so little about it. So we do have labels throughout the exhibit where we talk about use photos or primary sources and sort of point out things about them, show how historians use those to find out more about the past. And I think this picture is just a great symbol for the fight in North Carolina because we know so little about it. And so many of the women who did fight for the right to vote in North Carolina have also been sort of forgotten in our historical memory. Gertrude Wheel, who is on the left there, is probably the best known North Carolina suffragist, and she donated this photo to the state archives, but she only said who two of the women are. So the woman standing to the right of the tall sign and then the woman on the far right are both sisters. They lived in Goldsboro with Gertrude. So, you know, maybe this photo was taken in Goldsboro, we don't know. We don't know why this photo was taken. Obviously it was some sort of event, but there's no newspaper coverage mentioning anything. The man, we don't know who he is. He's holding a doll, and his sign says Battalion of Male Sympathizers, but we can't find any references to who he might be, or if there was a group called that, or if that's just for this photo. There's just a lot of unanswered questions about it. And as I said, it's kind of a symbol of what our knowledge about the movement in North Carolina is like. Another one of these call out labels here that, I want to point out, why did the fight for suffrage look different here in North Carolina and the South? Well, we can't talk about the fight for women's suffrage here without talking about racism, states' rights, and white supremacy. People in the South the majority of people in the South did not support suffrage for women because they were afraid it would reopen the question of who could vote. So the South has, since around 1900, effectively been disenfranchising African-American men through voter suppression, literacy tests, poll taxes, and the federal government has been letting them do it, but they're afraid that a federal amendment that also addresses voting rights again could reopen that question. They don't want to talk about whether women can vote because they don't want to talk about whether African-American women can vote. You eventually get some people here who support the state being able to say who can vote because then the state would be able to control it, but there's not a lot of support for that federal amendment. And one thing I think it's important to remember when we're talking about the suffrage movement in the South is that we're used to kind of thinking as the suffragists as the good guys in this argument, but both sides, the suffs, which is what suffragists were called, and the Aunties, which is what anti-suffragists were called, both of them made appeals that involved white supremacy. The anti-suffragists are very overtly, trying to keep white supremacy. The suffs, though, are making arguments that kind of fell along two lines, and they would be, don't worry, even if some African-American women do get the right to vote, if they are able to, get registered and vote, we white men outnumber them and we will still be able to outvote them. And then there's another argument that sort of says, well, we've been able in the South to control the African-American male vote and we'll be able to suppress that vote with the women as well. So that theme is going to run throughout the argument here in the South. Early on in North Carolina, as I mentioned earlier, those white women who are fighting up in the North are doing that starting in the 1840s, 1850s. There is hardly anything going on in the South at that time. You don't find people talking about women's suffrage here really at all. But by the 1890s, there is a little bit of a movement forming. The picture down on the bottom left, the painting, is of Helen Morris Lewis. She was a South Carolinian who had been living in Asheville, and she was very interested in the suffrage movement, was a member of NAWSA and was active nationally. And she and a friend of hers, Florrie Cunningham, who's also from South Carolina, had a public gathering in 1894. And this is the first time that we know of that women in North Carolina are calling for suffrage and calling for an organization to be founded. They had this meeting. There was, according to the paper, surprisingly good attendance. The mayor of Asheville actually attended, introduced them. And the people were interested enough that a week later at the mayor's house, they formed the North Carolina Equal Rights Association. So that's that first group here in North Carolina. They're active for a while. Helen Morris Lewis visits some local towns and speaks up for women's suffrage. She was a trained elocutionist. She was a very great speaker, beautiful, engaging. People liked to go and hear her talk, but the idea didn't spread all that far. And by 1900, sort of petered out. There's no evidence it ever really was statewide. It was mainly centered in Asheville. There is another woman, though, here we have Lila Barnwell, that we know was active early on in that same time period, attended national gatherings, and she did stay active in the movement later on. There's a gap between around 1900 and 1913 in North Carolina where very little is going on for suffrage, but she is active in that second period and actually runs for office in Hendersonville after women get the right to vote and is defeated. Helen Morris Lewis is actually the first woman that we know of who ran for office in North Carolina. She ran for superintendent of the water board in Asheville in 1899, but was also defeated for that. And then we know of one African-American woman who was active in this early period as well, Anna Julia Cooper, who was born enslaved in Raleigh, was educated here in Raleigh, but then moved to DC. And so in 1892, she writes a book called The Voice from the South, in which she is calling for, an end to racism, and she's calling for African-American women to have the right to vote on their own, that they have, their own special needs, and that African-American men and women should have the right to vote. She's the fourth African-American woman to earn a PhD, was very well respected, but she's not living in North Carolina at the time that she's calling for suffrage. One thing that I always like to point out from this early period, in 1897, this group that Helen Lewis founded did get a legislator from the western part of the state to put forward a bill calling for women's suffrage in North Carolina, and it was referred to the Committee on Insane Asylums, where it died and never received a vote. So obviously not a lot of statewide support at the time. So if there's not a lot of women asking for the right to vote in North Carolina, how do we get to the point where women are doing that? So we have a section called Organizing to Fight, where we talk about the North Carolina Federation of Women's Clubs. Around the turn of the century, 1900 or so, it became socially acceptable, even in the South, for women to join local clubs. It might be a book club or a singing club or a civic club. And it became this club movement that was very popular. And the woman in the upper left here, Sally Southall Cotton, founded or got these groups to come together to found the North Carolina Federation of Women's Clubs in 1902. And they became a politically active group. They couldn't vote, but they were married or related to men in power, and they were able to lobby those men to do a lot of things to improve the state. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who is the other African-American woman that we know was active in calling for suffrage in North Carolina, founded the North Carolina Federation of Negro Women's Clubs in 1909. And their motto, "Lifting as we climb," was very important to her, and she really believed that lifting up women would also help lift up the entire race. She spent her whole life fighting for voting rights, but a lot of that fight took place after 1920, trying to ensure that women of color could vote or could get the right to vote even through voter suppression. The image that I put in here, just wanted to show you, one, the dress is Sally Southall Cotton's dress in the case there, but the video that you see on the right is a really neat thing that we have in the exhibit. There's a wall opposite that has another screen as well. And we have videos with actors who are portraying North Carolinians, men and women, from the 1890s through the 1920s. And they are sort of speaking parts of the arguments that people put forward at the time, from newspapers, from speeches, from political flyers. And so you really, when you're in the exhibit, you get to hear people saying what people were saying at the time. And you can access these videos through our website. If you go to ncmuseumofhistory.org to our History at Home page and our videos on demand, you can watch all of these videos from home. So, as I mentioned, there was the 1890s. We had a group for a little while, but they petered out. It is not until 1913 that North Carolina has a statewide league. We are the last state to form a statewide league, a permanent one. There were a group of women in Charlotte, 7 of them, who came together and formed the statewide league. Before that, there were 1 or 2 local leagues. We know that there was a parade in Morganton, 4th of July in 1913, and there were women that carried some Votes for Women banners and then got together and made a local group. There was a local group in Bakersville in the mountains, but it's really just starting when they formed this league in Charlotte, but it is a statewide league. It's got about 40 members, men and women. The image here from the parade is like an amazing image for North Carolina. Like I said, we have so few images. These are some of the founding members on that float. The float, though, is not part of a suffrage parade. It's part of a different parade happening in Charlotte, but it is the only image of a float or image of a parade that we have from North Carolina. I have pictures of 2 of the founders there, Anna Forbes Liddell and Suzanne Bynum. Both of them were very active in forming this statewide league. Lavinia Engel there is not a North Carolinian, but she was an organizer that NAWSA sent down to North Carolina. Note, she is young and beautiful, and all the newspaper reports talk about how attractive she is and how well-spoken she is. She goes through, visits at least 20 different towns in North Carolina, holds meetings to, rise up the interest in women's suffrage, and most of those towns then form local leagues of their own afterwards. So you have a statewide league, and you start to have leagues across the state during this time period. 2 of what I think are the very interesting artifacts that we have in the exhibit. On the left-hand side, you can see here, it's a little hard for y'all to see, I'm sure, but it's got the yellow banner around the edge, and it says Votes for Women. So it's period Votes for Women stationary. This is a letter from Jessie McNell, who you can see on the left there. She lives in Linville Falls, and she is writing Mary Bell Palmer, who is another one of those original founding members, who was the treasurer of the league, to pay her husband's dues, because as I said, men and women were a part of this movement. And the suffragists in North Carolina really like to tout all the men that were involved in the movement. She also mentions that she's writing a column for the local paper that is pro-suffrage. And she's a really interesting person. And I love that in our collection already, we had this photo of her with her duck, Lancelot. The program there on the right is from the first annual meeting of that state league that was formed. By the way, you will see it referred to as the North Carolina Equal Suffrage League and the North Carolina Equal Suffrage Association. They use those terms interchangeably. And here we have Barbara Henderson, who was the first president of that statewide league. She is, has a PhD, is well educated. She was known nationally for translating a German poem during World War I. Her husband is Archibald Henderson, who is a professor at Carolina and is also a very well-known male supporter of the movement. I love that this is the image that she uses constantly for her publicity whenever she has any. She is pictured there as a mother with her 2 children. She is also, young, non-threatening. She was very much pushing this conservative idea of women in North Carolina asking for the vote from their men. It was not something where they were going to be strident. She actively comes out with things and says, we are not, militants. We are not, we're not going to picket. That's not the way we operate here. We just want the chivalrous support of our men to give us the right to vote because it is the right thing to do. And so that's really the tenor that the movement had here. Right next to this, we have a case with other items that belong to key suffragists in the state. We have the dress that you can see is Lillian Exum Clement, who we mentioned earlier, that the title of the exhibit comes from. She wore this suit probably around the time of the photo that you can see of her there when she was in the legislature. Gertrude Wheel, who I said was one of our top suffragists here. We have lots of individual items of hers from the Goldsboro Club that she founded. Lita Rodman, we have the sort of the bank book that she had when she was treasurer for the organization. And Chief Justice Walter Clark, who was probably the most vocal male supporter in North Carolina. He was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he was willing to go and give speeches in favor of women's suffrage. The artifact we have for him is actually a printed copy of one of his speeches. Also very overtly white supremacist in his support of the movement, but very vocal in that support. And the concept that we talk about in this case is that, we had those early clubs, the early movement, but it's not really growing that much until after World War I, when a lot of suffragists do a lot of war work and support the war, and they do see a big jump in membership after that and in support from men and women after these women have shown how civic-minded they could be. I think it is important also to point out that not all North Carolinians who fought for suffrage were doing it within the state. There was a group of women in DC in particular who were part of the national movement, some with NAWSA, but most of them with the National Women's Party. We have Ella Clapp Thompson, who was actually the woman that founded the Bakersville Club that I mentioned earlier. She was a national organizer for the National Women's Party, traveled all across the country. Minnie Brooke, who was from the Outer Banks and attended Trinity before she and her husband moved to the DC area. She was a very well-known street speaker. There was like a particular corner that she would be on frequently making speeches about the women's suffrage movement. Virginia Arnold, who we saw holding that Kaiser Wilson banner earlier, who was actually a step-niece of Walter Clark, the Supreme Court Justice. She also traveled nationally for this, organized for the National Women's Party, was arrested, jailed. So there were women that were involved in that party, but we're talking about probably less than a dozen North Carolinians who were active nationally that way. But some of these women, Brooke and Thompson, are in the photo here where you can see women marching to the Capitol. This is like a month after that parade that we looked at a while back where the police did nothing to hold back the crowds. They got reamed for that in the national press, and so you can see in this picture that they are definitely marching along beside the women, keeping the order, and that about 500 suffragists here are marching to deliver a petition to the Capitol, and there are some North Carolina women in that group. Another place in North Carolina where suffragists had a lot of support were some of the women's colleges. This is a time in the 19-teens where access to a higher education is available for more women in the state. 2 in particular, Meredith College, you can see here on the right, this is from their 1918 yearbook, and you can see that they actually had a suffrage league on campus. One of the things I think is interesting about this is the banner you can see that says Patriot, or you maybe can't see it, but it says Patriots, not pickets, with the women coming down the steps. And that clearly is delineating them with that NAWSA approach, not the National Women's Party approach. And the image here on top is of women at the State Normal and Industrial College, which is now UNCG. with their, this is one of the, they're not wearing them, but this is one of the few other images where they're holding the banners and the pennants. And the woman who is on the top row, second in from the right, is Harriet Elliott, who was a professor there at what now is UNCG. She moved from Illinois, kept her voter registration in Illinois because she could vote for the president there. And she taught politics and civics at the university and was very much part of engaging a lot of these women into support for the suffrage cause. And then the picture down at the bottom is also UNCG, or what is now UNCG. There were women who supported it at other colleges. These were just two of the bigger name colleges or the bigger groups. There were around 700 women from both of these that signed a petition in 1918 in favor of suffrage that was delivered to the two senators from North Carolina at the time, trying to convince them to pass the amendment. We have an area in sort of the middle of the exhibit where we talk about suffs versus anties and what those things meant in North Carolina, and we use more of those primary sources here. Suffs in general tended to be a little bit younger. They tended to have college education, sometimes out of state. They tended to come from families that were part of sort of a rising middle class or professional class of doctors, lawyers, retailers, newspaper men and women. That's sort of some general information about what suffs tended to be like. And then we have some primary things where we can call out, you know, neat little stuff to see from these sources. One that I wanted to show y'all is this letterhead from the Equal Suffrage Association. They, as I said, they really wanted men on board. They list 96 male advisory board members here so that anybody that's receiving communication from them knows that there are powerful men supporting them. There are 3 future governors on that list, and then lots of people who are doctors, lawyers, judges, retailers, all part of that, you know, rising professional class. Aunties tend not to have attended college as much or not to have attended out of state. Some of the suffs actually attended out of state and are exposed to the ideas of suffrage, you know, outside of North Carolina. Aunties have probably spent more time close to home. They have not worked outside the home, whereas a lot of suffs did have at least experience maybe being a secretary or a stenographer, some sort of work outside the home, librarian, things like that. Aunties are going to come from more socially conservative families. And also, interestingly, economically, a lot of the auntie support comes from textile mill owners or people who are in textile mill management, in the railroads and large agricultural land holdings, all groups who stood to lose out, they felt, if women got the right to vote, because there was an assumption that women would vote as a bloc for women's issues. So the suffragists would tout how women would help take care of society by voting to support women and children. The aunties, some of them were afraid they would do that and vote for stronger labor laws and antitrust laws, and that would affect them economically. Some of the primary sources that we use here, one I thought y'all would find interesting, is this Household Hints, which was put out by an auntie organization. And some of the hints in there are, you do not need a ballot to clean out your sink spout. Let's see, why vote for pure food laws? When your husband does that, you can purify your icebox with saleratus water instead. And then over under the spot removers, one of the key ones down at the bottom is that there is no method known by which mud-stained reputations may be cleaned after bitter political campaigns. And that was a big point that both the suffs and the aunties made too. Suffs said that women would clean up politics. They would get rid of the corruption in politics. Aunties said that politics itself would corrupt women and dirty women. And so that was kind of one of the back and forth that they had as well. Some other things that we have pulled out on that are letterhead from the male auntie league, and we've got listed, you know, this person owned a textile mill, worked in the textile industry, you know, owned several mills. And then the female league, you can see husband owned several textile mills. Husband was a bishop of the Episcopal Diocese. Husband owned large agricultural land holdings. Husband orchestrated the 1898 Wilmington coup. You can see that there are, you know, powerful families on both sides, and kind of see why their support came from some of these primary documents. Two of the points that, you know, we want to point out in this area, one is, so which was it? Did women really want the vote or not? A lot of anti-literature focuses on most women don't want the vote. You have, you know, a legislator who says it's just a few active agitating white women who are fighting for this. Most women don't want it. But then you have the suffs saying, oh yes, women do want the vote. We need the vote. You should give us the vote. We honestly don't know. The answer for us, for North Carolina, is there were no polls. There were no, you know, primary sources being recorded for anyone other than this, group of wealthy white women, both Suff and Auntie, who are either members of the leagues or who are distributing or writing this literature or the newspaper articles. For the majority of North Carolina women, working class women and women of color, we really don't know what their true opinions were about the being a Suff or being an Auntie, and whether they supported or didn't support women's right to vote. And then another key concept, especially I think for young people today who might be confused, is, why would women want to be Aunties? Why would you be supporting something against getting the right to vote? And the answer to that is there are several reasons. There were a lot of women who really liked that they were sort of on a pedestal. They liked their social position. They were afraid that this would make changes in society that would be detrimental to them. But a lot of that fear about society change comes down to a fear about the loss of white supremacy as well. And you can see that in the documents that from the time period and the things that people are saying from the time period. And then there's that financial connection that we talked about just a minute ago, that a lot of the key women leading the Auntie movement are married to or related to men who own textile mills, or they are large landholders. They have that connection to the railroads, which are hauling all these goods. And so you can find that connection for a lot of the Aunties. So it was a financial well-being reason for them. Here's our case where we talk about some of the Aunties in North Carolina. Important to note here, there really wasn't a strong Auntie movement in North Carolina until 1920. So the amendment passes in the Congress, and it's going to go out to the states, and those states have to ratify it. And it slowly becomes evident that North Carolina is going to become one of the final states that may or may not help pass the amendment. And so it's really not to the summer of 1920 when that becomes a little clear that the Aunties organize. They form a male-led group and a female-led group. They open up offices in Raleigh. They start distributing a lot of this literature. Before then, they were content to just sit back and watch the Suffs, because the Suffs, they had growing support. By 1914, they had the support of the Charlotte Observer, the Raleigh News and Observer. They had, support, but it wasn't as powerful, and they were still sort of fighting an uphill battle. When it gets to this point and it really, is going to be down to the vote, then they come out and they start publishing a paper. They're much more overt in their anti-suffrage efforts. So the dress that we have here belonged to Minnie Tucker Baker. She was lived in Raleigh. She was the secretary for that female league here. And you will not be surprised to hear that her husband owned multiple textile mills. Her father was one of the state's largest landholders. The male that we feature here, William Holt Williamson, we have the Pilot Mills ledger book here, is the artifact related to him. He owned Pilot Mills in Raleigh, along with several other mills across the state, and he was the president of the Male Auntie League, and was actually brother-in-law to Minnie Baker here. So there was definitely sort of a class of Aunties that were spread across the state, interrelated the same way that the Suffs were. The two other artifacts that we have here, one of them is actually a letter from two working class women or farm women who were supporting the Auntie movement. So it's not just people who own textile mills that supported the Aunties. There is, that support, just that fear of society changing that affected a lot of women too. So as I mentioned, we're coming down to this battle for the amendment that's going to be voted on in North Carolina. The Suffs think they maybe have enough support, but they're not sure. They've been, polling the legislators off and on all summer, trying to figure out where they stand. The Aunties have opened up that shop. They're, fighting. There's a lot of lobbying going on. It's going to come down, they realize, to North Carolina and Tennessee. Both of them are going to be discussing the amendment at about the same time, and only one more state is needed for its passage. You have a group of members of the House, 63 of them, who write this telegram and send it to the Tennessee legislature saying, hey, we're not going to vote for this. Please don't force suffrage on us either. You have the Senate in North Carolina voting. They were supposed to be voting on the amendment, but at the last second, they amend the thing that they're voting on to move it to the following year, to say they're not going to take a vote for another year. Now, they know full well that it's probably going to be answered by then one way or the other, but that way they're not going on record for it. In the meantime, Tennessee does pass it on August 18th. The day after that, the North Carolina House reconvenes, and even though they know that this is going to be the law of the land, they still vote 71-41 against the amendment here. So North Carolina had the chance to be that final state, but very actively decided not to be. It is not until 1971 before the legislature here passes a symbolic ratification of the 19th Amendment. Some of the women that you see at the bottom of this label here were suffragists, and we kind of show some quotes that they had right afterwards. The general sentiment is like Nell Battle Lewis there on the left is saying, it's like a slap in the face from your state when they chose not to do this. Gertrude Wheel comes out and says, we really would have preferred that our men give it to us. We tried really hard, but you know what? We're all gonna get to vote this fall anyway. So, these women fought for this. It was, some of them dedicated their lives to it. And so you do, wonder how they felt when their own state didn't pass it. But in the end, it was, they lost that battle, but they did win the war of suffrage, gaining that right to vote for those white women. So the rest of the exhibit, our Now What section, talks about what's going to happen after that. We have a section on the League of Women Voters, both the National NAWSA League and the State League very quickly transition into being a League of Women Voters. They're nonpartisan, and their job is to get all of these women, some of whom wanted the vote, many of whom did not want the vote, ready to vote. So they produce all kinds of pamphlets and booklets and literature about what it means to be a citizen. How do you vote? How does government work? Harriet Elliott, who we mentioned as the professor at UNCG, actually is one of the people who runs citizenship schools in the state. And women can go and take classes during these on, how is our government organized? How do you go about running a state and country? Because a lot of these women wouldn't have been paying as close of attention to that because they weren't allowed to be a part of it before them. Then we also have a section on the wait continuing for many, because as we've said, just because that amendment is passed nationally, North Carolina is not going to administer it in a way where women of color can vote. They are going to still struggle for decades through the civil rights movement until the 1965 Voting Rights Act gives everyone the right to vote in the state. We have a section where you can see that map of the United States on the label that is winning the vote but not equal rights. Alice Paul, our friend from the National Women's Party, wrote the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. It's presented to Congress every year, not until 1972 before they actually pass it and send it out to the states to be ratified. It does not pass. North Carolina is one of those sort of greenish yellow states that you can see there. That is one of 12 that never passed the amendment here. It was 13, Virginia recently ratified it, but if you'll look at that map, a lot of those states are in the South. Those are the same states that rejected the 19th Amendment as well. In North Carolina, it actually comes to a vote 6 different times between 1973 and 1982 and is rejected every time. We also have the Still Fighting section where we talk about, women continue to be active in political protests today. We have posters there from the Women's March, from the March for Our Lives. We talk about how women are still fighting for, access to the right to vote and other political issues today, and how now it's, perfectly acceptable for women to be marching and being out in the streets calling for it in a way that it wasn't during the suffrage movement here. And then our final, yikes, I just accidentally unshared my screen. Let me share it again. Sorry, the final section, which I'm now gonna have to zoom down to. Sorry about this. Where are we? Here we go. The final section is Still Waiting for Equal Representation. This is where we talk about women in politics here. Initially, after women get to the right to the vote, you have a few women who become national and state delegates for the Democratic and Republican conventions. They are, a few women are becoming mayors of small towns, but there's not a lot of women who are really making it higher up the political ladder. You do not have women elected to Congress. The first woman elected to a full term in Congress is Eva Clayton, and that is in 1992. She's also the first African-American woman elected from North Carolina. A woman does not win election to a statewide office where the entire state has to vote for her until 1996, and that's Elaine Marshall as Secretary of State. We have Bev Perdue's suit in here. She was, of course, our first female governor, elected in 2008. We have political items from some of those other women on the Council of State who were the first women to gain those positions, and those are all in the 2000s after Elaine in 1996. The shirt on the wall is from Isabella Cannon, who was Raleigh's first female mayor, and that's 1977. So it was even 1977 before a woman was mayor of a large city in the state. Sort of as you're leaving the exhibit, we have what we call our mirror wall, and this is where you can see yourself reflected in that mirror as you are looking at these other people, where we say, they fought to vote, what will you fight for? And these are men and women who fought for the right to vote in the 1920s, and then through the civil rights movement. And then our interactive there allows you to use the touchscreen to find out more information about those people, just showing you even more people who were involved in the fight here. And then you also have an opportunity to take a picture at our photo wall there, and you can see some of the women who worked on the exhibit right after it opened there. And we have one more of those call out labels there, like, why is our big photo op women sitting in an office? Well, you know, back to that same idea that in North Carolina, it wasn't parades, it wasn't, you know, standing on the street talking to people to convince them. It was sitting at a desk. It was writing the letters. It was lobbying the legislatures. It was writing the newspaper articles. You know, it was using that organizational ground outreach through writing and newspapers. It wasn't, you know, holding your sign and marching in the streets as much here. Those images that we have created for us by the National Women's Party of the huge parades and the big spectacles, that just wasn't what was going on here. But there were women who, you know, dedicated their lives to the fight here. You can see Gertrude Wheel is on the left, who we've talked about. Cornelia German is seated at the desk on the right, and then Sally Dortch as well. All of them are there in the offices of the State League in 1920 as the battle over the passage of the amendment is happening in Raleigh. One of my favorite things, I'll end with this, is this picture shows several of those Votes for Women banners. There's one across the front of the desk. There's one on the wall, and if you look carefully, there's also one on the dog sitting on the seat there. You can see the boy, that is Palmer German, that's Cornelia's son, there with what I assume is the family dog, and the dog is at least wearing a banner in this picture. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen intentionally this time and switch back to being able to take some questions.
That was awesome, Ray. Thank you. We have quite a few. So the first one is, why do you think that North Carolina did not ratify the 19th Amendment until the 1970s?
They very intentionally didn't ratify it early on. Those men did not want to be on record supporting it because they did not feel like it really was the political majority view in the state. I think by 1971, you know, this is when the ERA is about to be passed nationally. There's you know, the burgeoning women's movement after the civil rights movement as well. And so I think, you know, there's a lot more voices calling for it and pointing out that we never supported it before. And so then it's more of a symbolic gesture at that time.
In the slide that has Anna Julia Cooper, any idea what the large building is?
The large building that's up on the left of that, sorry, that is the courthouse in Asheville, where that first meeting was held for the North Carolina Equal Rights Association. That's where Helen Morris Lewis gave her initial speech on creating that women's suffrage group here. Sorry, I did not point that out initially.
Let's see.
It is not the current courthouse in Asheville, it's the one from that period. Sorry.
Okay. Was there also worry about the danger of women's colleges at this time? Any sort of negative feedback around that?
I think, you know, there's enough chatter at the time too that women are, you know, gaining this education and they're being exposed to these new ideas there. But that's just sort of a general thing that's going on at the same time that you have other families who are very supportive of the idea of women, you know, gaining an education and being able to support themselves. You know, initially there's still an expectation that most of them will probably get married, but you know, that's a new thing that's starting around the turn of the century nationwide, this concept of the young, youthful, you know, woman taking a new place in society. So, you know, there's support for that and there's opposition to it, just like everything today.
Okay. Last question. Who were the 3 future North Carolina governors listed on the Equal Suffrage Association document? Do you know?
Ooh, y'all are gonna call me out because it has been months since this exhibit opened in March. Let's see, who would that have been? I think McLean was one of them. It was not Cameron Morrison. Cameron Morrison did not support women's suffrage, so he was an anti. I'm trying to think, I believe Gardner was one of them, and might have been Cherry, but I would have to go back to double check on that. I apologize.
We have very, very attentive people who have these great questions.
To answer that in an email, if you want to email me, I will dig that out and get that for you.
No other questions, but just many messages of thanks and praise for such a wonderful and engaging program. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Ray, for the wonderful talk. And we hope that when we're able to welcome you back into the museum, you guys, you will come and see this fabulous exhibit in person, and you can experience that live and in living color. Thank you, guys.
White and gold, yep.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, guys. Take care, and we'll see you next month.